what I'd like to do is to welcome everybody to the BCS webinar. This is actually a combination of the Animation and Games Development Specialist Group, the Law Specialist Group, the E-Learning Specialist Group, BCS Women Specialist Group, Hampshire branch and Dorset branch. And one of the most exciting things we'd like you to do, preferably before it all starts, if you will actually have a look in the chat area, is a survey. Now, this is definitely would like to suggest that you would have a go. It's not a BCS survey, it's the ICO survey. And it's very much to do with the things that's going to be covered actually at the presentation by Cher. So certainly take down that link and possibly even start doing it now, because it will only take a few minutes to go through. Now we have on hand Cher, that if I can actually just get you to wave, who will be formally introduced later in a few minutes. And also Cher's manager, Michael, if you'd like to introduce. Michael will actually be looking after all the questions, because while we go through, because we're recording it and putting up the recording afterwards, we don't want to take questions during, so can you put your questions in the question and answer section? Any other sort of messages you can send around in the chat. But Michael's going to be keeping an eye on that, and he'll be feeding the questions through to Cher once we finish the recording. So we're only recording the presentation, not question and answers. We also have with us Sam. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, Margaret. Yeah, I'm Sam De Silva. I'm the chair of the Law SG, and very happy and pleased to be involved with this co-hosting with Margaret's SG and all the other SGs. So I think we were having a discussion prior to this, saying that in the day of the webinars, you know, we can actually collaborate much more easily, and you know, and you members get the benefit of this collaboration, so it doesn't need to be operated in silos. So we hope you enjoy this session. I'm sure sort of Michael and Cher will do a brilliant one, and you'll learn a lot. And yeah, look forward to it.
Also like to introduce Lucy, if you like to wave, from up in the Cumbria, who's also being able to keep an eye on the chat and also making sure that the test survey information comes through. Also specializing, she'll be coming back to do a webinar in the autumn about whistleblowing. And at that stage, I'm going to sort of move across to Michael. Now, I just mentioned before I do that, that Michael, hopefully, if all goes well, we should be doing a fantastic webinar for us on Monday the 13th of September. And this is actually follows directly through. And in fact, Michael, would you like to mention a little bit about that just before you introduce Cher?
Oh, thanks, Margaret. A little pressure there. So we are currently, my name is Michael Murray. I'm the head of domestic regulatory strategy at the ICO, leading on the implementation of the Children's Code. The Children's Code passed through Parliament in July last year, and it's started in its one-year transition period in September. So we're coming up to the end of that 1 year. So one of the goals we're trying to do is engage with industry in this transition period to help them get ready to conform to the code. One of the other strands that the ICO is looking at with the code is to engage children and parents as well, to raise their awareness of data protection, their rights, and how the Children's Code can be a benefit to them and help them in protecting them while they're within the internet, not being frozen out from it. So we're still developing our systems to help us. With products and with advice for kids and children and parents in schools. So I'll come back in September when those are ready and introduce everybody at that point.
If you'd like to introduce Cher then, thank you.
Absolutely. Well, tonight we are going to focus on the code, and it'll be presented by Dr. Cher Devi, who is one of our engagement specialists at the ICO. Cher is a PhD, has received her PhD in computer sciences. Before that, she had a long and successful career as a consultant project manager, analyst with business, starting back with BP and working across Asia and Europe. So Cher is working with us to raise awareness of the code and help the gaming industry especially to conform with the code. So although Cher's got that gaming specialism in her job, tonight's presentation is a bit more wide-ranging. So she'll cover beyond gaming as well. So Cher, over to you, and look forward to your chat tonight.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. And thank you, Margaret and Lucy, for additional support. Welcome, everyone. I hope you're well seated and you can see my slides and you can hear me okay. Right. Okay, my agenda for today is the Children's Code. I will briefly describe the scope of the code and list the 15 standards. As a refresher, I will cover some key terms and definitions and the data protection principles and also impact assessments. And I will briefly touch on the gaming industry, giving an overview of the landscape, followed by looking at each of the 15 standards and some consideration that you can take away at the end of the presentation to help you to conform with the standards. And also, I will talk about the work that the Ico Audit Team is looking to engage with industry in helping to industry to conform to the code. And also, as mentioned by Margaret earlier, ICO is doing a mini survey, and it's only a mini survey because there's only a short 10 questions. So I hope you will do the survey. And in closing remarks, followed by a Q&A. So I'll start my presentation now. So we have 15 codes. We call them standards. And we have identified the 15 standards and grouped them into 3 groups. As you can see on the slide, you have the code principles listed here, which is the best interest of the child, data protection impact assessment, age-appropriate application, detrimental use of data, data minimization, and then under service design, we have transparency, geolocation, parental controls, nudge techniques, and online tools. And finally, under data processing, we have policies and community standards, default settings, data sharing, profiling, and connected toys and devices. I have itemized some of these standards to indicate that they are fundamentally based on existing data protection principles and regulation. So it kind of give you a taste of what the code encompasses. Some of you may have attended webinars about the code or watched recorded videos on YouTube. The Children's Code, i.e. the code, is known formally as the Age-Appropriate Design Code. It's a statutory code of practice setting out 15 standards as shown on this slide. The code is not new law. It articulates the principles enshrined in the Data Protection Regulation, i.e. GDPR. The GDPR has been retained in UK law as the UK GDPR and should be read alongside the Data Protection Act of 2018, i.e. the DPA. Also, the code is grounded in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, formerly known as UNCRC, which sets out various rights and needs that online services will need to consider when using children's data. The code's ultimate vision is to create an open, transparent, and safer place for children to play, explore, and learn online. As clearly stated by the Commissioner, it doesn't set out to protect children from the digital world, but protect them within it. The 15 standards in the code are flexible, mutually supportive, and span across 3 groups, namely as listed on this slide. So let me talk a little bit about the scope of the code. As you can see, we have a couple of definitions, and one is the Information Society Services, or ISS, essentially deals with any service normally provided for remuneration at a distance by electronic means and at the individual request of a recipient of services. And services established in and outside the EEA, which is the European Economic Area, who are targeting UK users. And there is a term that is used in the code, which is likely to be accessed by children, is to be read as more probable than not. Online services such as apps, games or video games, connected toys, devices, and new services are within the scope of the code. And also, UNCRC define children as age under 18. So the code applies to all companies, businesses offering services to UK users likely to be accessed by children in the UK. In particular, I'll be talking about the gaming industry and services, for example, games, likely to be accessed by children in UK age under 18 is within the scope of the code. Next, let's look at some key definition and terms which are very relevant in the context of the code. UK GDPR Article 4.1 defines personal data as any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, or i.e. data subject or individuals. And you can see that, here I've listed what I call non-exhaustive list of identifiers, namely name, identification number, location, including geolocation, and online identifier. So online identifiers include IP addresses and cookie identifiers. Other factors can also identify an individual. And there, of course, you have the special category data, example, biometric data. And under UK law, the age of consent in the UK is 13. So any children aged 13 will need the consent of their parents or guardian. Next, we look at some data protection principles. Here I've listed, 7 of them, but there are in essence 6 data protection principles defined in Article 5.1. And in Article 5.2, there is also the accountability principle as well. So, so now let's kind of look at what the data protection principle also imply in the code, which is children merit special protection with regard to the use of their personal data. And measures such as technical or any organizational measures must be appropriate, risk-based, and proportionate. So there are already measures that you can use to help you to conform with the code, namely data protection impact assessment, DPIA, which I will discuss a bit later, and also privacy by design and by default, which is again specified in the DPA. And services generally need to demonstrate that they process children's data fairly and comply with data protection requirements. And bear in mind that children have the same rights as adults over their personal data. Okay, next we have a quick look at impact assessment. Essentially, if you're processing data concerning vulnerable data subjects, such as children, and you're targeting children as well, you will need to do a DPIA. Is mandatory under the law. Essentially, you need to take into account different ages, capacities, and development needs, and ensure that your DPIA builds in compliance with the code. So in essence, when you do a DPIA, to assess and mitigate any risk to the rights and freedoms of children that arise from your processing of the data. Furthermore, in the code, in the standard, which is standard 1, which is the primary consideration of the code, talks about the best interest of the child. And that should be also taken into consideration when you do any impact assessment. And further, and also another standard which talks about detrimental use of the data, again, is embedded in the standard, which you also need to consider when you do the impact assessment. The detrimental use standard essentially ensure that any use of personal data, of children's personal data, you need to ensure it's not detrimental to their well-being. Next, also, as part of the code initiative, ICO team has produced a harms framework, and the harms framework essentially provide additional support to help you to address the risks and freedoms of children when you do any impact assessment. I will outline the harm framework briefly, but bear in mind, the harms framework is still very much work in progress at the moment, but it's something which is very relevant and useful for organization to do impact assessment. Essentially, on a general level, what the framework aims to do is to support organization to understand the rights children hold under the UNCRC, and to identify the risks and harms they will need to consider to support these rights, and to navigate their way to appropriate guidance within the code to address these risks. At a high level, to consider rights to self, the right to support for guardianship, social and economic, and also the right of society. Now I will present briefly the gaming industry landscape. Just a little bit background, I did a brief research on the gaming industry early this year to get a sense of who are the stakeholders, and ended up with a draft roadmap, which I'm sharing with you today. Please note that it's a draft overview and a snapshot of a very complex and dynamic industry. Most of the items listed are common, I hope so anyway, gaming industry terms. As you can see, there are diverse stakeholders or actors, if you like, and multiple channels which serve the end users or consumers, including gamers. In terms of the code, who provides or publishes the content and who distributes to the end users or gamers are just some questions which need to be addressed in your impact assessment. Furthermore, games are accessible across multiple platforms and devices, including social medias. Okay, as you can see, all the actors. In exploring data processing activities, I have identified these activities as shown below. In your assessment of data processing risk, bear in mind that personal data processing, including any third parties' involvement, would need to conform with the code. So you need to include appropriate contractual agreement, for example, with any third parties in your impact assessment when you're doing your impact assessment. And I welcome further comments on this framework. I'm happy to learn a little bit more on how the industry are looking at their own landscape, so to speak. Now let's examine each of the 15 standards in a little bit more detail. These are all the so-called description of the code standards. And you should really include all these 15 standards into your design and development specification, and especially when you conduct your DPA. In essence, all these 15 standards should be part of your requirements or features of your whole service delivery chain. is quite a lot because there are 15 of them. And what I suggest you could do is to read this at your leisure, and hopefully they will provide some starting points to look at the code and the details in actually how to comply with all these 15 standards. So now let's examine some of the standards. I have actually picked a couple of standards to look in more detail. There are 15 or in total, but for the time I've got for this webinar, I've decided to pick a couple which I feel are very relevant for the gaming sector, and also which generally are a topic of discussion and debate as well. As you can understand, I've not even used any of the gaming issues that have been identified, such as microtransactions, loot boxes, all the features of a gameplay. But the code will apply irrespective of whether you are using microtransaction or any other gaming features. So to bear in mind that it's fundamental to look at the codes in more detail when you are designing and building your games. So the best interest of the CHAR, I've listed here, is when you're designing and developing your online services, you must consider the best interest of the CHAR throughout your whole development and design phase, essentially. And also to take into account their age, keep them safe from exploitation risks, and protect and support their health, well-being, physical and psychological development. And to remember that your use of their personal data shouldn't affect any of these factors. And I have identified some tips which will give you some starting point when you're looking at the best interest of the CHAR standard. The best interest of the CHAR standard comes from the UNCRC and is basically the fundamental principle that is enshrined in UNRC that all online services must take into consideration. In balancing of interests, the interests of the CHAR have high priority. A best interest assessment is flexible and should be adapted to the decision and actions on a case-by-case basis, in light of the specific circumstances, needs, and diversity of the particular group of children or children in general. Next is the data protection impact assessment, which is mandatory activity that you need to do. You need to ensure that you undertake a DPA assessment and to assess and mitigate any risks to the rights and freedom of children that arise from your processing of their data. I have identified 3 key steps listed here, which is essentially, synthesize the key DPI activities. On the ICO website, you will find the generic DPI steps as well, which I believe there are 7 of them. So just to kind of set the context, it's quite a comprehensive type of activity that an organization would need to conduct. And it's not new either. DPI has been around for quite some time, but the code actually, if you like, manifests the whole area of doing DPIA. So it's an activity, an exercise that you must conduct. I have identified some tips as listed here. Essentially, it's like privacy by design and security protection. You need to design data protection in from the start. And you need to also screen for potential indicators of high risk that will give you an idea of the impact of the detrimental use of the data on the children. And also you can use relevant level of confidence measure to assess the likelihood or severity of this risk. And also to include, as you go along when you do the DPIA, is to include explanation of how you conform to each of the standards. And most importantly, don't forget to document your compliance with the code. Next is the age-appropriate application standard. And this has generated a couple of debate in the gaming sector, and I'm sure other sectors or ISS have similar issues. Generally, current finding is that any tools or techniques for age assurance is still immature and is evolving as we speak. So the ICO is also looking into providing more support guidance on age-appropriate application. Essentially, you need to take a risk-based approach to recognizing the age of individual users and ensure you effectively apply the standards in this code to child users. Again, I have listed some tips here, which hopefully will give you a little bit more clarity on how to comply with the age-appropriate application. So you apply the code to all users. If you're unable to offer level certainty appropriate to the identified risk, so as part of your risk assessment, you identify a list of risks and how certain you are or how confident you are that you are able to apply the code to meet to apply the measure to meet the code. So the other way is where you use self-declaration and you are using profiling measure. So you can indicate, you can use self-declaration and profiling measure to help you to indicate the user is a child. And when you use self-declaration, you have to make sure you is supported by measures which discourage false declarations. And finally, account holder confirmation, which is used a lot by gaming companies in account management. Limited profiling, you can use limited profiling solely for the purpose of age assurance. And also, any profiling can be used to estimate age where this is proportionate to risk. You must be sure that you can mitigate similar risks around unreliability, bias, and unfairness. And also important, which is part of data minimization, only collect the minimum amount of personal data that you need for this purpose, and don't use any personal data you collect for this purpose for other purpose, which is data, which is, again, enshrined in the data protection principles. Parental control is very relevant in the gaming sector, and has been used in various by various gaming companies to offer parental guidance on relevant games for their children. Essentially, it kind of offers, it's a tool that allows what I call age rating organization rate the games using specific guidelines. If you look at some of the games published on the website, you can see pictures of age rating labels, for example, provided by Peggy and the likes. So that is some form of parental control tools that is available currently for parents to help them to, if you like, pick the relevant games that is suitable for their children. So basically, it provides children age-appropriate information about parental controls. And also most of the service provider allow parental monitoring, which makes it, a bit more, I call urgent that it has to be obvious to the child when they are being monitored. So parental controls basically now involves ensuring that the child is informed when they are being monitored. Again, a couple of tips here, which will help parents to understand a little bit more about the code. And so basically, the parental control is used to support parents in protecting and promoting the best interests of their child. So again, the best interest of the child is the fundamental consideration in all aspects of the code. And to make it clear to the child, if parental controls are in place and if they are being tracked or monitored. So this is something the code organization will need to ensure that if there are monitoring tools in place, the child needs to be well informed. And again, in the ICO website, under parental control standard, there is a table showing the 5 age range and some recommendation, and they should provide a good starting point to help you to conform with the codes. Again, I mentioned earlier, age rating scheme, PEGI, which is the Pan-European Game Information, which is recognized under UK law. They provide age classification and age rating for video games. And also they even provide descriptors, for example, for games, in-game purchases that has, labels or descriptors for games that have in-game purchases. Again, I think gaming companies should be encouraged to use the label more, which I don't believe they are doing it right now. Similar services are provided by the Entertainment Software Rating Board, the Esrb. So there are a lot of tools available for parental control. It's just, the code now enforce the need to provide these tools before children are able to kind of use the games, to make sure they understand the content of the games, the nature of the game. I think it's a lot to cover, isn't it? We're nearly finished. Thank you for staying with me. So next is profiling. Again, profiling is quite a heavily debated topic, because earlier, as you can see, the complex network of players in the gaming ecosystem. So, profiling is quite an important topic to ensure that you bring it up when you are doing impact assessment. Essentially, you need to switch options which use profiling on by default, unless you can demonstrate a compelling reason for profiling to be on by default. And of course, again, taking account the best interests of the child. And only allow profiling if you have appropriate measures in place to protect the child from any harmful effects. So you have the detrimental use standard coming in here. And again, we're not saying you can't do profiling at all. Profiling may be used if it's essential to the provision of the core service. And also because profiling touches on tools, such as cookies, you also need to consider the PECA rules, which is the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulation for any cookies that you're using to process personal data. Again, a couple of tips here. As I mentioned earlier, the standards kind of interlock and mutually support each other. So here, when you do profiling, you need to also consider privacy setting. So most profiling essentially will be subject to a privacy setting. There are 3 exceptions listed here. Essentially, if you're profiling to meet a legal or regulatory requirement, then you're not subject to a privacy setting. And also to prevent child sexual exploitation or abuse online. And this is something which we want to highlight, because you can use profiling to assure age, so you can properly apply the provisions of this code to child users. Okay, so we're finished with the standards now, and hopefully there's not too much to absorb. I've only touched on a couple of standards, but I'm sure there are other standards that potentially we can have a good discussion on. As mentioned earlier, that there are various strands of work going on in ICO at the moment. And one particular strand is the work by the ICO Audit Team. Essentially, the ICO Audit Team is looking for organization to volunteer to participate in a collaborative project on the code. And the audit team is keen to learn more about how organizations are able to demonstrate that their services use children's data fairly and allow children to explore, learn, and play online, while ensuring that the best interests of the child are the primary consideration. To that end, our audit team is inviting companies to come forward and willingly to participate in a collaborative project. The overall intent is for this to be as collaborative as possible, and for companies to provide their viewpoints from their own perspective, which would help the audit team to develop their investigatory work in this area, while providing the volunteer company with practical advice and recommendations to improve your policy and procedures. The work will involve a review of some of your policy and procedures, a demonstration of the data and user journeys within your systems or service, and meetings or consultation with key people such as your research teams, system designers, and privacy personnel. The audit team will produce a report for you at the end of the project that will contain useful feedback and recommendations for you to take forward to improve conformance with the code and data protection compliance more generally. The report, however, will be purely for organizations' own internal use, and it would not be published on the ICO's website. You're welcome to request for a collaborative engagement using the email childrenscode@ico.org.uk or audit@ico.org.uk. So this is the mini survey that I mentioned earlier in my introduction. Essentially, it's a very short 10 questions survey. The intention of the survey is to gather some background information about attendees and also how ready you are to conform with the code. In the survey, you can also include comments in question 9. So please do take some time to do the survey. And I really thank you for taking the time to listen to me and to do the survey. Bear in mind, please, the survey is not a BCS survey, it's an ICO survey. Thank you. Finally, my final remark, do keep in touch. There's ongoing initiatives at the ICO. For example, we have a team of UX design experts looking at ways to help organizations to conform with the code. So there'll be interesting guidance coming out, hopefully not too long. Do subscribe to our e-newsletter at ico.org.uk, and welcome to email us at childrenscode@ico.org.uk. And also, for everything you need to know about the Children's Code, do visit our hub, which is at it's called the Children's Code Hub. And of course, you can also keep in touch using the various social media. And thank you for taking the time to listen to me and be patient with me. And of course, finally, we have the questions. Do post your question using the Q&A windows, and all the questions that we don't manage to address today, we will collect the question and hopefully use them for our Q&A. So I thank you very much.